This is House Planning Help, episode 356. Hello, I'm Ben Adam Smith, and this is the podcast for you if you're interested in self-build or retrofit. I'm exploring what houses we should be building in the 21st century and trying to break down some of the major roadblocks that may get in our way. Coming up in this session, my guest is Kym Mead, and we're going to be exploring Passivhaus certification. What actually is it? How does it fit into the quality assurance process? And how do we work with a certifier, or are they invisible to us because our design professionals are sorting all of this out? So we will explore this topic. And of course, at the end of it, you get a lovely plaque to go outside your house or wherever you would like to put it. And I remember putting ours up and thinking, oh yeah, that's quite nice that we are now identified, but it really is a great conversation starter. And one of two things happens. Either someone comes up and says, what is that? Why have you got that on your front door? And then that opens the door to discussing low energy buildings. Or someone comes up very excited. Oh my goodness, this is a Passivhaus. I've heard about this. And then again, asks you all sorts of questions. So a nice conclusion to this journey. So let's get into this chat with Kym Mead. And I started by asking him to tell me a little bit about his background.
My background is architecture. I worked for numerous architectural practices in and around London and Hertfordshire. And I went to work for the BRE in the Passivhaus consultancy team. So I was working with Andrew Peel and Gavin Hodgson at the time. They both left to sort of ventures new, and I took over the business there. Introduced the CEF training course that the BRE were running at the time, which Strathclyde University now run for BRE. And yeah, had a great time. Great 4 or 5 years. I mean, I was travelling a lot. Sort of in China, fantastic experience. Working in South Africa, fantastic experience in the US, in Portland, Oregon. But my wife and I started a young family, and travelling was no longer an option. So I decided to set up on my own, initially offering architectural services and consultancy and Passivhaus certification. But I found that straight away I was busy just Passivhaus certifying, and from that point onwards, that's all I've been doing.
That must be a little bit unusual, because not every Passivhaus certifier would have that design background.
No, in honesty, I think it's better with a more sort of an engineering background. Some of the problems that you need solving maybe sit better if you have that professional background. But experience is key also, and you've been doing it long enough that you can just see some of the issues that may arise anyway, and you're not solving problems that you haven't solved before. So it's it's absolutely fine.
You were one of the first Passivhaus certifiers that we had in the UK. So how did you train for it?
So initially there was myself, Peter Warm and Paul Smythe, and I did an internship at the Passivhaus Institute in Germany for 3 weeks in Darmstadt, which was, again, great fun. You got to work side by side with the Passivhaus Institute, certifying projects and sort of learning on the job. It's changed now. It's more course driven. You have to go through the CEF training course first, be a designer, have a level of experience, work on certified projects. I'm not too sure what the criteria is, whether it's like 3 domestic, 1 non-domestic, or just have extensive experience, but then you apply, you can be invited along to the certified course, sit the course, sit the exam. There's a period of monitoring, and then you're able to certify buildings as well.
I suppose we should probably start to talk a little bit about certification. So what is it?
Essentially, as I describe it to people, it's a helpful audit. We are independent. We sit independently from design through to construction. I always say it shouldn't be a draconian process from top to bottom where there's a big scary certifier saying yay and nay. It should be a helpful process. We all want to get to that same point, the certified building, and we should all work sort of collaboratively together. You find your way of working. Each project's different with its own sort of levels of experience and problems to solve, but as long as everyone's on the same page, it should be as painless as possible.
If we're coming to you for the first time, what are you going to say to us first of all, and how are we going to go through the project together?
So if I receive an inquiry, my first question is who's involved? Is there a Passivhaus consultant involved? Have you run a sort of initial checks through the PHPP, carried out the initial energy balance, how's it looking, how's it performing, and those kind of questions. And you can gauge from those answers the level of experience within the team. Now, the way that I price projects isn't necessarily based on the levels of experience. I just know that if there is less experience, I'm going to be a little bit more involved. If there's some very experienced people on the team, people I've worked with before, they know how I like to work, and I know how they work, and it's going to be a little bit more of a streamlined process, I think. Now, as I mentioned, the pricing structure doesn't necessarily change. I go by the floor area of the building necessarily, rather than the experience of the people involved.
So we are talking generally houses, possibly retrofits as well. What if I come to you and said, Passive House planning package, what's that? What would happen then?
I would be as informative as possible, perhaps direct them through to a few websites, maybe to speak with a consultant first if their architect doesn't have the experience and they're just looking to tiptoe into the world of Passive House. If there is an initial design, that should be looked at, because there could be some early improvements which could save cost later on. But that's really the job of the consultant, really, or the certified designer, to be able to give that advice.
What are you looking out for then?
Common errors are overly glazing. We've kind of moved away from that now. There is a lot of good literature out there from the Passive House Trust has initiated, but way back when, the people just assume Passive House, solar passive, we have to have it self-orientated with a lot of glazing, but then you run into problems of overheating, and that is a real issue at the minute. So, yeah, it's looking at those things, the amount of glazing that you have, the orientation, built fabric and U-values and things like that maybe people are sort of have initially, but you can probably look at without the building being modelled in PHPP, know that it probably won't get there.
Just while we're mentioning overheating, is it still that 10% of the year overheating is a pass, or has that come down over time? No,
a pass, the threshold is 10%. We advise pretty much across the board now that, you should be getting below 5%, really. Some designers, some architects, some clients try to future-proof their building and maybe have a look at things in a slightly longer way than the sort of the weather data or the climate data that we have in PHPP. But really, yeah, you should be below 5% now.
Is it the client that's going to interact, or because we've talked about designer a few times, they are going to be the ones that are going to bring you into our team?
It can be client-driven. It can be sort of designer-driven, really. If it's a self-build, I do get contacted by the clients directly, and I think that they've probably received a steer from the designer or the consultant or the architect to say you need to engage with a certifier. But maybe some of the larger projects, or if the client's new to Passive House and they've been advised and persuaded by the designer, architect, consultant, then sometimes they come from the consultants that we work with.
Now, what are you doing, say, on a day-to-day basis? What are the tasks that fall within those things that you're looking out for, like the glazing?
More often than not, looking at a PHPP, from sort of initial checks, somebody's unsure whether they want to go down the Passive House route or commit financially or otherwise to Passive House certification. They might send you a PHPP and say, we've modelled it, could you have a look for some small errors? The PHPP is a very informative tool anyway. You can see pretty much straight away how the building's performing and what changes need to be made. I'm always dubious if it's very early stages and the building is just passing. I'd like to say, look, aim for 12 kilowatt hours per metre square per annum, but I'll certify 15 when we get there. It rarely comes down, the performance of the building, as the design develops. The wiser, more experienced consultants will have some very conservative cold bridging entered into the PHPP. Yeah, some non-high spec glazing, moderate insulation, that kind of thing, that that as the building develops you can improve upon anyway. So yeah, the more experienced people out there will be doing that initially anyway.
I imagine with bigger projects there might be more of a case for a site visit, but is there any reason why we might want you to come to site on a self-build?
I'm always happy to. It's a conversation I would have up front with the client or the architect. If they would like me to, that's fine. I will build something extra into the fee. It could just be their first Passive House and they need that reassurance on site. If they're experienced, there's less need. If it is a sort of a one-off dwelling, there's less need for the certified to visit site if an experienced designer or architect's already visiting site anyway. We do ask for extensive photos at various stages, and the things that we're normally looking for are insulation continuity, the airtight barrier, the penetrations through the airtightness barrier, delivery notes, making sure the correct insulation has been installed. A common example I always give when training is we can design a building, it can have the levels of insulation that we need, but it comes to a contractor, and contractors like to value engineer things. They may look at it and sort of think, actually, the lead-in time on that type of insulation is too long. I can get the same thickness of insulation, but the lambda value may be slightly different, which means it's going to perform slightly differently when modelling the PHPP. So these things we need to watch out for. We need to make sure that the contractor's aware that any changes like that need to be fed back to the design team so we can check the levels of insulation. It might look exactly the same, but it might perform slightly differently. It might be slightly cheaper. So we just need to make sure about those things, hence why we ask for sort of delivery notes and proof of the type of insulation that's been installed.
It reminds me, on some of our drawings, we'd have various different things specified as you'd expect on a technical design, but there'd always be little notes. If you want to change it, it's fine, but just come and tell us what you're going to change.
It goes back to my point earlier where it's a collaborative process. It shouldn't be sort of a draconian process. We're all there. I want to be as helpful as possible, although I can't sort of say you need to use this type of insulation. But we want to get to that same place. Everybody wants to, in the most painless way possible. So if something does change on site, any product, just feed it back to the design team so they can run their checks and then feedback. And well, more often than not, it's going to be absolutely fine, no problem.
What other evidence are you collecting?
There's a lot. We need evidence on all of the glazing, the MVHR units, pretty much everything, drawing, orientation, photos of the orientation. It's quite an extensive list. Now, it isn't necessarily a difficult list to produce. It's more focusing people to be able to provide that information. It isn't a normal building regulations build where you have building control that come out, sign things, have a quick look, sign things off, and yeah, fine, there you go. We need to know exactly what's gone into the Passivhaus, then the PHPP, and then the evidence to support that. So we can't just say, yeah, we've used insulation again as an example. This bit of insulation is absolutely fine. It's like, well, I want to see the evidence of that, i.e. a photograph, a technical data sheet of the type of insulation to prove exactly what's been entered into the PHPP.
Does this encourage a better job as well? I'm coming along, I'm going to be taking some photos of this.
Yeah, I think it focuses people to the job in hand, and it's relaying the message that, you know, there's a no blame culture in building a passive house. If something goes wrong, it's a construction site, things always go wrong. They're busy places, lots of trades coming on and off, for example. If something goes wrong, just let someone know. Let's fix it there and then. No one's going to get in trouble. It's better to fix it rather than hide it, get to an air test and find out actually there was a bit of a tear in an air barrier or something that could have been fixed quite easily, but it was hidden, and now it's been covered up, and now we're starting to see it, and actually it's going to be quite costly to the remedial works for that to fix it. So yeah, it's just introducing this sort of non-blame collaborative process.
Is airtightness quite an easy one to check because someone's coming out for that, doing the test, and then you'll get some paperwork?
Yeah, it's a physical test. So, you know, there's someone there with a fan doing a sort of pressurised and depressurised test. So it will, at that point, show something up if something's not right. You can get some sort of thermal tests carried out for insulation. If bits of insulation have been missed from walls, they're quite useful. They were nice to have as opposed to a hard certification criteria of what I need to see. I would certify a building if without a sort of thermographic survey being carried out. But, you know, it comes down to trust as well. I might ask for a little bit more information if I feel as though maybe, I don't want to use the word misled, but if I want some more information about a certain area and I can't quite get that information that I need, it kind of a couple of little orange flags go up and a little bit of intuition kicks in, and I'm not getting the information, or something's not forthcoming, or somebody's been quite sort of elusive around a certain area. I can just dig a little bit and find out. And normally you get there, and it could just be a misunderstanding, or, you know, things are absolutely fine, or actually, you know, we just need to redo this just to make sure. You know, there have been occasions where we've opened up walls, we've had a look, and the insulation just isn't as it should be. So then you do a little bit more work, exploratory work, and find out actually we just need to pull all that down and start again. It's unfortunate when that happens. It's largely not a malicious thing where people are trying to hide it. It's maybe lack of knowledge or lack of support. it comes back to that collaboration and communication, which is key to delivering a passive house. That maybe that was lacking in a certain area, and somebody's just carried on because they were under time pressures to produce the certain things, and it was just missed, and it was put up quickly on a Friday afternoon or something like that. So.
Is there anything we can do as clients to spot this as it's happening? Because we're probably the most likely to be on site.
Yeah, absolutely. I think if something doesn't look right or doesn't feel right, just raise it. Even if it is a sort of a conversation or a question to the builder, he might say, oh, yeah, I know we've done it like this because we're going to be doing it like this in a minute. And then when it all comes together, it will look correct. It's always good to sort of be looking sort of abutting insulation if there are gaps between sort of the insulation boards, or there's a bit of slump if it's more rock wool based insulations. And if it doesn't look right, raise the question, ask the question. That's the best advice I can give. It could just be that a quick explanation or something may suffice.
Is there ever any post-occupancy evaluation done because we're not sure whether something has happened, or because the process is in place, it actually rarely gets to that?
Yeah, I'd always encourage it. I wouldn't discourage it. If it's your own home and you just want to know how it's performing, it's great if you can do that, and please share the results to the Passivhaus Trust or the architect engineer. Let's celebrate it, because more often than not they work and it's good feedback. There has been the odd occasion where sort of a passive house is not performing as it should do, and we've gone in and we looked at the reasons why, and it could be anything, sort of a fault with the MVHR, whether that's human error, installation error, or just manufacturer error. These things happen, and we can look at that, we can go in and fix it.
What are the red flags on that then that would make you know? Because living in a passive house myself, I know it's generally working. You get that feeling when you walk in the door, you don't get the draft. So there's an element of that. But say, for example, mine is a masonry construction, and I wonder whether every single piece of insulation really is up against it. So things like that, what difference does that actually make to the big picture?
It does have an effect. If there is insulation in your walls, I'm sure they're not, because I checked and certified it, so I'm sure that isn't the case. But, these things do happen over time. There are a couple of cases now, and certain things we're starting to see. Now, Passivhaus is maturing in the UK. The services, essentially, it goes a little bit further than just replacing some filters. We need to actually service the MVHR units every 4 to 5 years to make sure that they're running and that, if they're recommissioned or rebalanced. That should be happening now. We're starting to see a few cases in social housing where the residents don't necessarily have access to the MVHR, but maybe the maintenance agreement with the sort of the local authority, people have moved on and things aren't getting serviced as they should be, and it's starting to have effects on performance of these buildings. So this is something that we collectively as certifiers and the Passivhaus Trust are sort of looking at now.
So just going back to that example then, when you say it's having an effect on the performance, what are you meaning? Are they noticing the air is a bit funny?
Air quality, cold spots. Yeah, it's there's certain things, people are comfortable in different temperatures anyway. Some people run a little warmer than others and they don't feel the cold as much, but you shouldn't be feeling that cold in a passive house. If there is, then there might be something wrong. Might be something that just needs to be realigned or rechecked or looked at, and more often than not, it's because the MVHR needs servicing.
Yeah, and they tell you that it's in the instructions as well, but we all know what life can be like sometimes. That
we don't always clean our gutters either.
Yeah,
every year when we should do.
So a bit like with a driving test, where you could create an argument, okay, you can drive, but perhaps we should be checking every 20 years or so. Does certification last forever?
That's a good question. So I certify on a date, and on that date, providing everything's commissioned, to have the air tightness and everything is certifiable on the certificate, there'll be a certain date. Say on this date, the building complies with the Passivhaus standard. Now, people live in houses differently. They may choose to have their doors and windows open more often than their next door neighbour, and the houses may perform slightly differently because of the way that they choose to live in the buildings. Now, if you own your house and you want to put new windows in or you want to extend it, then it can be classed as a material change of use, and it can null and void the certificate, the Passivhaus certification. So that's something that We haven't really got to yet where people are extending existing passive houses, but there is some literature in the PHPP manual that sort of highlights the material change of use. One concern I have, some of the larger projects that are being looked at now and designed now are maybe going towards gas boilers, which we shouldn't really be doing, but it's not my job as a certifier to say that you can't do that, with the idea of maybe changing to a district heating system in 5 to 10 years or whatever. And that's why they're going with boilers as opposed to a heat pump now. My concern is that there could be some local authorities that are spending an awful lot of money on these buildings that have a Passivhaus certified, that in 5 years, if they switch to sort of a district heating system, that their Passivhaus certification could be voided because of that. So this is my concern. So we're going to have passive houses, lots of them large projects, and then they're going to switch the heating strategy and it may null and void the certification, which would be a shame.
You know these sorts of things are going to happen. What about we're going to change the windows? I know it's way down the road and probably hasn't happened much with any of the passive houses, but is that the same argument, or does it have to be done carefully so that, look, I am doing it properly, I get my certification back?
Yes, it needs to be done carefully. If it's a slightly different performing window, they are your primary heat source, your windows, you could be affecting the overall performance. I would run the calculations again just to see how things are doing, or maybe even prior to installing the windows, see how these performing windows are going to affect the overall PHPP calculation. You can go for recertification. It's an administration cost with PHI. It isn't the same process again, and you can have the building recertified, but you would need an up-to-date air tightness test, and you would need a commissioning on the services again, I would have thought. So, yeah, and it's the same. I mean, there was a project recently, and they certified to a passive house, and they then, a year later, installed some PV. Now they recertified as a Passivhaus Plus. It was a recertification I sort of went through with the Passivhaus Institute, and again there was additional cost to doing that, but you can sort of recertify a previously certified project if there has been material changes.
Let's go more generally now and think about passive house certifiers. So we talked right at the beginning about you being one of just 3, and now there's more choice. So
yes.
Does it matter who we go to?
It's personal preference. I mean, I'm lucky enough that I've been doing this a while now. I have some repeat work. I work with designers and architects readily and certify all of their projects, and I'm sure other certifiers can say the same. There is a wider choice, absolutely. I think there's 8 to 10 now certifiers in the UK, all with different levels of experience, different backgrounds. I would recommend to anyone go out to get as many fee proposals as possible if you're looking to certify a project. Everyone's listed on the Passivhaus Trust website, so they're there and contactable. There are larger organisations, smaller organisations like myself, which may play a part in cost. I always say it's just me and a laptop in my kitchen, and I tend to be competitive when it comes to pricing, and I'm quite proud of that fact. I like to keep things as, if it's somebody's own personal money, if it's a self-build, then I try to keep things as competitive as I possibly can.
Yeah, we like to hear that too. What about the end of the process then? So we talked about all the evidence that you're getting together. Is it more or less when that airtightness test is done, or what else needs to happen?
So I like to be appointed as early as possible, maybe in and around planning, just before, just after. Some initial checks and feedback can be provided. It could just be through experience or another project that I'm working at that time that I can relay some information. This is the part of the role as a certifier. We do have experience. There probably isn't a problem now that we haven't faced at some point if we've been doing it long enough, and we're able to sort of highlight these areas. It could just be that what I consider a problem may be client driven. They may have nice sweeping views by the kitchen, which is north facing, and my advice would be to try and minimise some of that north facing glazing because it's greater heat loss, but actually they want to capture those views. Fine, there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. Advice then I would give is you're likely going to have to make it up in larger, more expensive walls and U-values, etc., etc. So it's finding that balance in those initial checks, which the consultant will be doing as well. When it comes to sort of stage 4, I'd like to do a sort of a technical design stage sign-off. At that point, we should have all of the information on all of the windows, the insulation, everything should be fully detailed. There should be no questions unanswered at that point. So when we get to site, everyone has that level of reassurance that if the contractor builds as specified, it will achieve the Passivhaus standard, provided we meet the airtightness, and all of the buildings commissioned and all the as-built drawings are kind of reevaluated. That's the happy place we all like to be. Sometimes it doesn't always work that way. Yeah, there are sort of questions unanswered. We should have, at that point, the U values locked in, the windows specified, and the MVHR, certainly. There should be design freezes on the actual design, but sometimes things do change. And then we have to kind of deal with that as we go.
And a lot of this is good practice, though, as well.
Yes.
It's really good to have a solid plan that you're just going to go on site and execute.
Yeah. Yeah, it should just be that easy, shouldn't it? It's building houses never is. It's not only sort of practical thing, it's an emotional thing as well if you are self-building. And if it's your house and you're investing money and into it and you do want to make a last-minute change, that's your right. And that's our job as certifiers and consultants and architects to just manage that. If it is going to be an issue, explain the issue. And if they still want to go and it may jeopardise the final Passivhaus certification, then that's okay as well. If you want to make that last minute change, it's your house. We just have to sort of give the self-builder the information to be able to make their decisions.
Yeah, it's quite interesting, isn't it, how sometimes it's the not knowing because you're doing these things for the first time. Yes, I want big windows, but then you don't realise big windows mean probably you then have to invest in some shading.
Yeah.
You're adding expense that you didn't need, but you maybe don't see that by just doing these sorts of things. So are there any instances where you come to an end? You talked about they don't have to go to certification. I certainly know of a couple where, and probably involving a lot of glazing is what I'm thinking about, but for whatever reason they got off the certified track and perhaps they have a very hot house because of it, that kind of thing. I could certainly think of a couple of examples like that.
Yeah, some of the earlier projects, the big drive was we need as much solar gains as possible. That's our primary heating of a passive house. We want to reduce our running costs, etc., etc. We just weren't focused on overheating. We sort of think the UK's got such a rubbish climate most of the year that actually overheating just wasn't on our radar, but it really is and really was. And so there are some of the earlier projects were probably at greater risk of overheating than some of the projects that are being delivered now. We have part O in the building regulations now, which specifically deals with overheating, and these assessments need to happen. Part O wasn't there 10, 15 years ago. So, yeah, there is always a risk. I've only ever once downgraded a passive house, and that was through air tightness. They just couldn't get down to below 0.6 air changes per hour. As hard as they tried, they just couldn't get there. So I certified at the low energy building standard, which is a very good standard still, but it's there for the harder to treat stroke near misses buildings that maybe not orientated as favourably, or they're overshaded or what have you. I always say with a low energy building standard, it shouldn't be something that you aspire to build as such. You should be going for Passivhaus Classic. It's still a very good standard, but aspire for Classic. If you can't quite get there because of orientation, cost, budget, all of those things, overshading, then that's what the low energy building standard is there as well.
Is there anything that you would like either designers or the self-builders themselves to understand about what you do? Anything that you're thinking, I wish they would do that?
How do I put this? Certification can be quite time intensive. There's a lot of information that we have to go through to make sure it's right. We don't want to be in a position where we get things wrong. We're all human. Everyone's human. We are that extra pair of eyes, and we can pick out things through experience. And we do have to register the building with the Passivhaus Institute. They may have further questions. So you're always under time pressure when certifying, and some of those time pressures are out of your control somewhat. So whilst we may have lots of questions, interrogate the building and make sure everything lines up and stacks up, when we issue the building to the Passivhaus Institute to get the serial number, they can spot check us. And it's more a spot check in the certifier than the actual design. And they may have some questions, and we may need to come back to the design team to sort of find a more rounded answer. So yeah, it's those things that happen maybe in the background that I wouldn't say we're shielding the design team from. There's stresses and pressures on us from not only delivering for the client, but the Passivhaus Institute, who are ultimately answering to as well. So, yeah.
What would you describe as the difference between a certified building and something that isn't certified but perhaps tried to follow the same ideas?
I'm always wary when people sort of advertise Passivhaus principles. I'm not too sure what that means, and I think it can mean various different things. Like we picked up some U values of zero. Well, we read something 0.15 in our U values on the walls and our floors, and we've adopted those. So we've adopted some Passivhaus principles, but we haven't got an MVHR, or we have an MVHR and we're not too worried about the air tightness. They're kind of piecemealing certain things, but Passivhaus is a holistic assessment of absolutely everything. I'm always wary of Passivhaus principles. It feels like people are being a bit misleading. They're trying to sort of promote themselves on off the back of something, but they haven't actually sort of adhered to the standard anyway. So we've been doing Passivhaus for long enough that it shouldn't necessarily be that challenging. If you don't want to certify a building, you know, that's up to you, but then just don't say that you've adopted Passivhaus principles in your building. Yeah, go for the certification or just build a really nice low energy building house.
And how much is this likely to cost us?
So costs can vary depending on the size of the house and maybe sometimes the level of experience. I tend to focus my costs purely on the size of the development rather than the level of experience from the team. And that can range from somewhere between £2,000 to £3,000 for a modest size single dwelling. Other certifiers may have a different fee structure, but that's tend to what I work to. Like I think I mentioned earlier, I try to keep things as competitive as possible whilst also taking my time into account. And
do you ever feel that certification might add some value to the house? It's probably a pretty vague question.
We've heard things over the years that actually there have been some estate agents that have added 2 to 3% of above market value on some dwellings when they go to market. So I don't know how that's quantified, whether they've just kind of plucked that 2 to 3% from the air. But yeah, I do think they add value. I think they're tried and tested in terms of performance. That data's there, and it's slowly becoming more and more, I wouldn't say quite a mainstream yet, but we're starting to affect certainly mainstream construction and regulations and policy and things like that.
Is there anything else I should be mentioning around this topic of certification?
Just if people do want to become a certifier, if there are any designers and consultants out there, then I'd certainly encourage it. There is a lot of work. I've not heard of a certifier that isn't busy, and long may that continue. But yeah, just reach out to a certifier, have a conversation, an honest conversation. I know all of the certifiers pretty much personally, and they're a good group of people, and I'm sure they'll have just an open and honest conversation with anyone if they wanted to know more about it. One of the good things about the Passivhaus community in general is everyone's very open and willing to share. Yeah, it's quite a nice place to work.
Is there a final thought, either repeating something that we've already mentioned or just something else to add to the conversation just to close up on?
A while ago, there was a performance gap that was a huge issue for the UK, and we were using certain tools, I won't mention it by name, but it's a 3-letter tool, to try and justify building performance when it is more a regulatory tool, of compliance tool. And it caused a few issues. We've kind of moved beyond that now a little bit. Passivhaus does exactly what it says on the tin, in the sense that if you want a building that performs, it's a very robust assessment, and it will more than pretty much all the time deliver what you require.
Kym, thank you very much.
You're very welcome. Thank you, Ben. Cheers.
Head online to take a look at the show notes for this episode, houseplanninghelp.com/356, where we've got a summary for you just so you can reflect on the conversation once again and get straight to the key points. If you'd like to make a comment or ask a question, also you can do that within the show notes, or we'll give you social media links. We'll link you across to Mead Consulting. Once again, houseplanninghelp.com/356. My call to action is to check out the hub, and we work quite hard on this, trying to think, well, what else do you need? How can we make life easier for you? And so that's why we put this all online. It's a digital resource that you can dig into at your own pace. We've got videos, we've got courses, we bring in experts to answer your questions. I try to share contacts where I can. We try to do everything that we can possibly think of. So come and take a look, find out what it's all about. houseplanninghelp.com/join. Next time, Judith Leary-Joyce is my guest, and we'll find out why tackling a home retrofit didn't stop there. It actually motivated her to write a book. So that next time. Thanks so much for listening. The House Planning Help podcast is produced by Regen Media, content that matters.